Hello, my name is Laura Morreale. I'm a medievalist and an independent scholar who works in Washington, D.C. I'm here with my colleague Ben Albritton, rare books curator at Stanford Libraries, and our contribution to the birth of the UnEdition Symposium stems from a series of 4 crowdsourced transcription events we organized from May 2020 until January 2021. The first 2 of these events were known as the International La Sfera Challenge, and the second 2 as the Image du Monde Challenge. These events relied heavily upon digitized manuscript images that scholars can now access and engage with collaboratively online. And as these projects unfolded, they ultimately led both Ben and I to reconsider the function of traditional scholarly editions and how the editorial training that many of us first received may or may not align with the technologies of communication and dissemination that currently shape our scholarly landscape. Now, as these events played out, once again, they inspired Ben and I to think not only about the concept of the unedition, which we'll talk about just a little bit more in a moment, but also about the vital role that a manuscript's readers and transcribers might play in understanding a text and in creating a community of scholars who become engaged with and even charmed by the many ways that medieval texts have found expression over time. Now, since these events were created and executed as a result of conversations that Ben and I had in the early days of quarantine in April 2020, we thought we could introduce these projects to you in the same way by bringing you all in on some of the conversations that we've had as we facilitated and witnessed these 4 transcription events transpire. So I'll begin by explaining how the events were structured. Ben will cover the technical aspects of how we made them happen, how the data is stored and retrievable for others who would like to see what the projects accomplished. Then we'll chat a bit about what the events have meant for each of us in the context of our own scholarly work. So I'll begin just briefly to talk about how the 4 events were structured. The goal of each event was to bring together several teams of 10 people each to transcribe one version of a particular text that exists in multiple copies and is available online. The transcriptions of the digitized manuscripts that each team produced at the end of the 2-week competition were then evaluated by 3 judges who awarded a final prize, and it was just nominal, based on how quickly, how accurately, and how collaboratively a team's transcription was completed. Now, over the course of all 4 2-week competitions that took place between May and January, close to 100 scholars transcribed a total of 8 different copies of the 15th century Italian geography book called La Sfera, and 5 copies of a 13th century French treatise on cosmology, the Image du Monde. And behind me here, you can see the 2 websites that we created for these projects to bring our scholars together to organize the material, house the transcriptions, and allow participants to reflect upon the experience of interacting with these texts and with their teammates along the way. Now, the La Sfera text currently exists in over 150 manuscript copies, but it's never been critically edited, which I guess is not a surprise given the number of witnesses. And the Image du Monde has been partially edited, but no full print version has ever been published. So at the very least, what these events accomplished, what we all created and made available online, is an open access version of several new variations of the La Sfera text and the only full text versions of the Image du Monde existing outside of the manuscript format. But we feel that the challenges produced much more than just the data that was created during each iteration of the challenge. What we experienced during the transcription events in working with multiple versions that represented our final products brought about a kind of knowledge of the textual tradition that is simply not possible with more traditional editorial products. The uneditions that we created during these events, that is a kind of unspooling of what a critical edition might bind up together in the guise of normalizing the text, allowed for a connection to each version in its messy humanity, in the endearing errors and missteps and misreadings that we can all relate to as readers and as storytellers. So over the course of these events, we didn't just transcribe words from one medium to another. We experienced each version of the text on its own terms, in conversation with our teammates, and of course, with the long ago scribe. So I'm now going to hand things over to Ben, who will talk a little bit more about his experience with the challenges and some of the technical requirements necessary to make them happen.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Albritton, a medievalist and rare books curator at Stanford University. I came to this project interested in the ways that digitized manuscripts and the software tools that are being built to help users interact with them might expose us to new ways of working together in a decentralized way, producing data that serves a given purpose, but which can also be reused in many different ways once it's been created, possibly even in ways that the originators of that data might not have imagined. A decade or so ago, when we were starting to imagine the kind of interoperability that has become known more broadly now as the International Image Interoperability Framework, or IIIF, we were working very closely with medieval scholars trying to both understand the kinds of work they were doing with digital manuscripts and to imagine together the kinds of tools that people might use to really engage with medieval manuscripts in ways that didn't fit the existing paradigm for academic scholarship. Jim Genther, now at the University of Toronto, but at St. Louis University at the time, was deeply engaged with producing a digital edition of the Norman Anonymous, a manuscript held at the Parker Library in Cambridge, manuscript number 415. Through his experiences and a strong philosophical desire to, quote unquote, show the work behind the edition, from the mediated text to basic transcription and right down to the image of the original text, he had us thinking a lot about what software could do in the process, but also about how to capture some of the raw, rarely seen data that scholars produce in the course of creating an edition. Rough transcription, notes, casual observations, thoughts about scribal choices. All of the data and decisions that underpin a printed edition could be captured and made available both in support of the edition, but also for other kinds of investigative purposes. Jim and the wonderful digital humanities team at the Walter Ong Center at St. Louis University produced the first IIIF compliant transcription tool for medievalists called TPIN as part of this intellectual and experimental process. If we fast forward a decade, there are now multiple tools on the market that allow for a particular kind of interaction. Cultural heritage institutions are making their digital objects available through IIIF, meaning that software developers can pull that content into a variety of platforms to be used for many different purposes, and bring content and users together in online communities that allow the kind of intense, collaborative, team-based work that we've seen with the transcription challenges that Laura has organized. For these, we used From the Page for the transcription platform, though as Laura will show, that was just one component of the overall challenge framework. Ben and Sarah Brumfield, the developers of From the Page, have been actively engaged in the IIIF community, and their tool provides a number of very compelling features that we wanted to explore with these challenges. First of all, the ability to bring manuscripts from multiple libraries around the world together into a single interface at the touch of a button. It took us less than an hour to assemble the content for each challenge because From the Page is using interoperable images hosted in multiple locations rather than having to copy and rehost all of the images. Second, all of the transcriptions produced in From the Page are linked through the web annotation specification with the images that are being transcribed. That means that we can extract the transcriptions from the Page environment and reuse them in other software platforms. Third, it provided an easy way to keep track of who is contributing to the transcription challenge so that we can credit the participants once a challenge completes and the data set produced becomes an artifact in its own right. Finally, as Laura has suggested, we were relying on an ever-growing software ecosystem that allows us to present multiple versions, both image and transcription, side by side in a variety of viewing environments. And just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, if we look at this manuscript in the context of its original hosting institution, the Vatican, we can navigate through it, but we can also use IIIF to pull it out and then examine it in more detail and transcribe it in from the page. Those images are still being served by the Vatican, but now we're adding a layer of data on top of it in from the page. And that new data is linked to the original information through IIIF, which we can then use to export into a new environment altogether and examine it in the Mirador viewer with the transcription side by side. And now the transcription and the digital images travel together as part of a digital package. So this process of bringing together interoperable images with community source transcriptions, these can now be reused to drive full text search in a host institution for text mining and other analyses programs, and even to use as models for machine learning algorithms to help transcribe additional manuscripts in the future.
So I'd like to just walk you all through the website for the Image du Monde Challenge. I think to give you a sense of how a challenge takes place, how the information has been organized, and what participants do as they engage in the challenge. So you can see here we have the challenge landing page, gives a little information about it. And I'll just say about the Image du Monde, the Image du Monde text itself was rather long. And in order for participants to be able to complete the transcription within the 2-week period, we had to break the entire text into 2 different sections. So we had the Image du Monde 1 that took place in September, finishing in October, and the Image du Monde 2 that took place in early January of 2021. So you'll see on this website, there are 2 different iterations of the challenge. In any case, what happens is, as we say, as I said before, we have these 10-person teams, and when you decide that you would like to do a challenge, you are placed on a team or choose a team that you would like to be on. And then each team has its own team page. So I think at this point, we'll look at the phase 2, and we'll look at team 3. And the reason we're looking at team 3 is team 3 was the winner of Image du Monde 2. So what you can see here is that team 3 has its own page, and it has a transcription portal so that when you click on it, you'll go and to the manuscript and the transcription pane, which is here. And you can see that this is where the team did its transcription work. The project log tracks how all that work is done, and each team member will note when they've completed their work and when they've done the revision on each page that they're responsible for. And then finally, there's just a click to the rules and guidelines of how one is going to go about transcribing this particular manuscript. What I'll also note is that each team is required to put 4 updates on their team page to kind of let us know, everybody know, how the transcription went, how the challenge went, the discoveries that they might have had. And frankly, I really love these posts because it's really at the moment of interaction with the manuscript, or with the manuscript image, if you will, that those small discoveries take place. And we've asked teams to record those small discoveries because they're wonderful and sometimes they're lost over the course of the big project. So you'll see here that team 3 did a wonderful job, not only talking about what they found in the manuscript, but a little bit about how their work progressed. Here's a great Wordle that talks about that brings forth their conversations from their Slack channel. So this is the things that they were talking about during the event. And then finally, and here's a wonderful video. And then finally, just to let you know at the end what each team needs to submit. They need to submit their final transcription as it appears in the portal, the project log, their own transcription statement. In other words, the rules that they have come up with as a team for how their manuscript might be transcribed. And then finally, these 4 blog posts that come up on the team page. But just in terms of what the the site itself does is it's this meeting place for all the teams to come together to see what's happening with the other teams, check them out, see how well they're doing within the context of the challenge. But also we have a wonderful participant map that helps us know, who's in within the challenge, and some other fun things that keep people involved in the challenge.
So tell us, Laura, about your thoughts around transcribing text from multiple witnesses. Why is this important in your scholarly thinking? And what are your thoughts about the outcomes from the community transcription challenges?
That's really a great question. Thank you, Ben, for asking that. I mean, as a historian, I tend to approach different witnesses to a text as distinct historical events, more perhaps than literary scholars might do, who are motivated by, I think, different kinds of questions, such as the origins of texts, authorial intent, things like that. And this is not to say that these questions aren't important. I think they're vitally important. And frankly, if they didn't do them, I couldn't do some of the work that I like to do. But I really, I delight in the variations that we can see in these multiple witnesses, because it's here that we really interact with those scribes as individuals, who are undertaking this sort of graphic act, either with or without understanding what the text was meaning, and doing all these sorts of human things that people do when they write things down, when they put ink to parchment, when they attempt to record something in writing, and they do so imperfectly and with their own style. And really, it's in this up close interaction, I think that the teams had with these manuscript images, that I saw really the power of this collective approach, right, on several levels. The first was simply in the way that the teams of transcribers were able to solve problems and to really unravel meaning, in the way that an individual scholar who was working with a manuscript alone might not have been able to do. Each and every team member, and I think really no matter their level of expertise, brought something to the effort, a new way to look at the images, to add meaning to the team's interpretation, things like that. And then secondly, I think that the amount of camaraderie created around the work, of the scribe or scribes, and that group dynamic, came across in the close attention to the object that was created by another person. And I think, that camaraderie almost replicated, the sort of medieval experience of receiving that text. Now, because I think each 10-person team had their own manuscript to transcribe and to come to know, and team members communicated intensely during this 10-week period, or excuse me, 2-week period that they were allotted. And they usually would communicate in these sort of closed communities on Slack. What developed was this really close attachment to the text and to the scribe, and sometimes teams would even name their scribes. There was Francois who was around for the Image du Monde. We came to know these texts intimately through processing the version together, right? And then it was only, I think, once we all came back together as a larger group of challenge participants, that we were able to see how these individual communities were in fact related to each other in terms of the more abstract text we had all come to know in its various forms. It was an experiential interaction with the text, one that was directed by the long ago scribes who produced the item around which we could all gather, not some sort of modern editor who was dictating to us how we should interact with the text. So it's I think, a new way of thinking about what a text might be.
Laura, you've described an UnEdition as a mapping out of the chaotic variations so characteristic of medieval textual production, and a rendering of difference in machine-readable and manipulable format ready for future analysis. We often think of printed editions as a way of accessing a text mediated by an editor. The UnEdition seems to bring value as a locus of community creation, investigation, and engagement. If you agree with that assessment, could you talk a little bit about the sustainability of not only the data produced, but also the community learning experience that comes from this engagement?
I think sustainability is such an important aspect of digital scholarship. And I think one of the important things that we did, and I did off the bat with these projects, is to create an archive of everything that was produced during the event, all of the transcriptions, of course, but also all of the web pages, scraping the Twitter conversations, the project logs, and the data from the transcription platform that plotted out really how all the work took place, which pages had the most corrections, for example, or how much time each contributor spent on his or her pages, and a lot of other great metrics. And all this material has been archived in the medieval digital repository known as Bodo Archive. And there's a narrative cover sheet that sort of tells the story of how all of these events transpired. Now, in terms of the community learning experience, I think there's a lot to say about what we all learned about these two texts, which I alluded to. But I think what's more important are the opportunities for the one-on-one learning that took place within the context of each team. And I think that was facilitated by simply creating a platform for people to come together and exchange expertise in a rather low stakes environment. I myself witnessed some wonderful teaching and learning in the context of the teamwork that I did. And I've heard other participants report on how much they learned, or even some mentoring that they did that occurred as a result of the networks that were created during one challenge or the other. And I think networks is a wonderful, another step that we can talk about, another outcome. I will also say that by bringing these texts to the attention of other scholars, we've also inspired further work on these particular texts, but also given people the opportunity to think about the kinds of texts they themselves would like to bring to this framework. But just in terms of La Sfera and the Image du Monde, we are currently involved in a mapping project that comes out of the place names that are found in the La Sfera text, and also a lemmatization project that was inspired by having these 5 versions of the Image du Monde. So those are 2 sort of specific outcomes that these projects gave birth to. So Ben, I have a few questions for you. When scholars produce keyboarded versions of texts, whether the source materials are in manuscript or in printed form, they're also creating information that can be accessed and analyzed using computer-based technologies. And I'm just wondering what possibilities you see for the data that's been created in these transcription events, and in fact, in any kind of UnEdition that we see produced in the future as we're now defining it.
Thanks, Laura. That's an excellent question. When we think of traditional editions, we're often thinking about a text that's been mediated by a scholar, usually for an intended audience. And that might be a general audience, or it might be a scholarly audience, or undergraduate students, or something like that. But we don't often think of the text as data. And one of the things that really excites me about the challenges that you've organized so far is that we now have raw data that can go back to libraries and holding institutions, to people who are interested in doing text mining or text analysis with computers, or even for training handwritten text recognition algorithms. So stepping back a little bit from our community of scholars who have produced these wonderful UnEditions and transcriptions, and thinking about the afterlives of the data that they've created, we can start to think about using specific transcriptions to drive full text search at cultural heritage institutions. As I had mentioned before, we can think about using this as training data for machine learning algorithms to help transcribe more materials with similar hands, and build scholarship that way as well by providing access into images of manuscripts without necessarily people having to have the skills that our current crop of transcribers have. So there's something kind of exciting about the fact that not only are they producing an UnEdition of a text, but they're also building a foundation to open up more texts to other scholars in sort of unintended ways. So thinking a little bit further through that, the UnEdition, at least as we're working with it, you and I, becomes more of a platform for further types of exploration. the text itself isn't the endpoint, but as you've talked about, building communities of scholars is an endpoint, building knowledge that can be reused both by cultural heritage institutions and other scholars without having to read the text is another approach. So there are a number of facets that come along with this that are different from a published mediated edition for an intended audience. And in some ways, what you are doing with these challenges is opening up possibilities rather than restricting a text for specific audiences. And I find that from a library perspective extremely exciting.
Yeah, it really is exciting. And particularly when we're collaborating with people who bring in so much knowledge beyond, what many of us have been trained to do. And so, working with folks like you is the best because we see those possibilities open up. So, in speaking of, how this material then ends up in libraries, just at the Dark Archives Conference in November, you spoke about some of the difficulties of cataloging the kinds of materials that we've produced in these crowdsourcing efforts. And I'm just wondering how, bringing in more uneditions might challenge or change current library practices, particularly in terms of cataloging and, of course, discovery, because you don't want to create these things and then not have anybody able to access them or know about them.
Yeah. Oh, excellent question. And I may flounder a little bit with this, but I'll try to respond to it. And please feel free to pull me back on track if I go off. There are a couple of things to think about when we're discussing both long-term preservation, long-term access, and citation for these types of uneditions. Obviously, we want to capture the names and roles of all of the participants, which you've done very well with your archival packages, so that we can assign traditional creator roles to those people for the initial data set. What we don't really have the infrastructure for at the moment is smooth mechanisms for bringing that data back into the cultural heritage institution as part of the digital object or as an adjunct to the digital object. In the way that I was talking about previously, that sort of virtuous circle of images being out in the public, scholarly enhancement of those images through transcription or other interventions, and then bringing that back in some sort of meaningful user interface. Areas to explore in that area, I think, are things like what Dr. Jeff Witt has been doing with round-tripping transcriptions back to cultural heritage institutions. But for libraries like ours, we don't have a mechanism yet for harvesting that information back and then representing it in our own very generalized library digital platforms. So let's take one of our manuscripts as an example. If we wanted to bring in a transcription from one of these manuscripts in the Les Ferre Challenge, for instance. Because we've used IIIF, the International Image Interoperability Framework, to serve the images out to a transcription tool, in this case from the page, and because from the page maintains the relationship between the text that's being produced by the transcribers and the images in their original context in the holding institution, technically it's pretty easy to bring those two pieces back together and present an experience using a viewer like the Universal Viewer or Mirador to show the transcription side by side with the images. What we don't have in many cases, I'm not sure I know of any currently in production, is a way for curators in these libraries to bring these texts back in and then represent them natively as part of the digital package that we're serving out. So I think there's some really interesting areas to explore for cultural heritage institutions in terms of bringing those texts back in, serving them back out, and then providing proper citations for the various elements of the digital object. So it's pretty clear when we're serving a manuscript out from Stanford or from the British Library or the BNF, who is responsible for those images. We've cataloged them as traditional library objects, and we're serving up that descriptive metadata in most cases through our library interfaces. Now, if we layer on top of that a transcription produced by up to 10 transcribers, and perhaps vetted or edited by somebody else, that's a layer of information that we don't really have a mechanism right now to present. We could make the transcription downloadable and accessible separately from the digital object and cite it properly, but then bringing that information back into the digital object to make it full text searchable and still somehow give credit to the people who created the transcription, that presents an interesting cataloging challenge more than anything else. And so there are areas where libraries, museums, and scholars are going to need to work together to help understand the requirements. So for our transcribers, in many cases, they will want credit for the work that they've done, and rightly so. And for libraries and cultural heritage institutions, we want to provide a standardized way of telling people who is responsible for the various components of the objects that we hold. So coming together and thinking about what citation looks like, both from a scholarship point of view or from a general user point of view, and then from the library catalog itself, becomes a bit of a challenge, not one that can't be overcome. It's a technical challenge. But what I'm hoping is that as more and more of these types of data come back to cultural heritage institutions, that we can use that as a driver to address the situation. So we're not there yet, but producing data like this becomes part of the long-term requirements for collecting in the cultural heritage sector, and learning how to present that information back is an interesting challenge. One of the things that always strikes me is that in 3 to 5 years, our library front ends are going to look very different from what they do now. So if we're talking about creating an edition and relying on that ephemeral front end to be part of the edition, that becomes very problematic. But if we're talking about an UnEdition as disparate pieces of data that can be brought together in a number of different types of front ends, then in a lot of ways, preserving each part separately and relying on software to bring it together solves some of our sustainability problems. If we boil in the data with the way it's delivered, then we're building in fragility. And if we keep the transcriptions from the UnEditions separate from the archived packages of the UnEditions, and yet somehow tie it all together with robust descriptive metadata, then we can always represent this in not just one, but many different types of software interfaces. And so the UnEdition becomes this massive data that drives a user experience over time. Hopefully not too static, but hopefully also sustainable in the long run.
And what I just love about these comments, I think goes back to sort of the original idea about the UnEdition, right? And the fact that we can't even conceive of an UnEdition unless we have the technology to create it, right? But we have to think, I think, all the way down the line in terms of how that ends up in the catalog, right?
Right.
Being restricted as we previously were by print, the way that sort of the entire textual tradition could be presented was confined in that one book. But now it can be everywhere, but you have to then manage the everywhere
That's right.
of your text. Yeah,
exactly
thank you.
Right.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Laura. So, Laura, you've now overseen, I think, 4 of these community transcription projects. How would you like to see this initiative develop with more projects to come?
I think one of the things that we've learned over the course of the pandemic is that there are many ways to do scholarship. And that we've come to see how the digital platforms can allow for different kinds of projects to take shape, and really for different people to participate. I think prior to this, we all had a sense of who could participate in scholarship and maybe who couldn't. And I've seen in terms of geographic expanse, but also sort of professional diversity, that this really has opened up who can participate. And I have been overwhelmed by the kinds of input that have come from people you would not expect to feel confident about participating in scholarly work. So just in terms of opening up scholarship, that's one thing, but certainly in terms of having this framework that I think is helpful to people, I would love if other scholars would take this framework and put their own texts within that context. Okay, we need to stop here.